Mercedes Formula One team re entered the sport 15 years ago, and in that time, they've seen 7 Drivers' Championships and 8 Constructors' titles added to their trophy cabinet. As the team rose through the midfield of the V8 era to become the frontrunners of the hybrid regulations, they showcased what dominance truly means in Formula One. Now, though, the driver who won 6 of those 7 titles has left the team, and in his place, a rookie who, much like Lewis Hamilton himself, is rumoured to be the sport's next star, is taking over. How will Kimi Antonelli fare, and what will the team's 2025 look like? That is the topic of today's show, and to help me answer that question, I'm joined once again by Crash's F1 writing team, Lewis and Connor. Good morning, guys. Connor, what do you think the environment within Silver Arrow's HQ is going to be like at the moment?
I think when you're a top team like Mercedes, it's going to be optimistic. It's like new year, new me type vibes, really. It's a new era, as you touched on, with Antonelli joining the team. Last week, they had the launch of their new sponsorship with Adidas, so they've got a new kit which looks amazing. Toto was there, George, Kimi and Valtteri, so I think there's like good vibes, there's good morale. I think with the rules staying stable over the winter as well, I think Mercedes will be hopeful that this is the year. Now, we've got 3 years of learning. 2025 is the year we're finally going to put everything we've learned into a good car. And I think when you've achieved what Mercedes have, I think the optimism of having a great season has to be there. So I think, yeah, the vibes will be good. I think Toto will be like, I know Lewis has left, but it's a new era. We've got Antonelli, Russell. So, yeah, I think the vibes will be good. But obviously that will change when they hit the track later this month in Bahrain. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And, yeah, should be good.
The question really is then, you mentioned that we had 3 years of learning, right, after the regulation change into 2022, where it felt like Mercedes had really taken a misstep, quite an unexpected misstep, and not got their technical formula right for that new set of regulations. Then we heard years, after that we're still learning the car, we're still trying to understand the technical package. But in the meantime, they were getting beaten by teams who had already come to understand that technical package. Lewis, do you think that they do understand it now, and we can expect, for that not to be a talking point this year? They're going to have to do something with that learning rather than just keep talking about, the learning that they're doing.
I wouldn't be confident to say that I think they've understand what's going on. I think we've seen, as you mentioned, for several seasons now, they've sort of almost been going around in circles, trying to figure out and get their heads around these regulations and exactly how to get the best out of these cars. And like you say, we've seen, I think in McLaren, the obvious example there, we've seen what they've been able to do in terms of sort of going from right at the back of the field to understanding their car and figuring out how it works and developing themselves right to the front, as we saw at the end of last season. And Mercedes just haven't been able to do that. And we've seen these fluctuations throughout, particularly the last sort of 2 seasons, where some weekends they've been really competitive, they've been really strong, they've been the team to beat, but they don't seem to understand why that's been the case on those occasions. I think back to Las Vegas last year, they absolutely dominated. Russell dominated the race weekend, and Hamilton was able to come back to second despite starting a bit lower down on the grid after an issue in qualifying. And that just showed how much performance they had that weekend. But we didn't see that on a week-by-week basis. I think, that was helped by cooler track temperatures and those things that sort of played into the W15's strength. That was one of the rare strengths of that car. But in terms of finding an answer, I don't think we're at that point yet. And Toto's sort of recently come out and said that he expects to see those fluctuations still this year. He doesn't think they'll be able to get rid of them completely. And when you're already sort of coming out and saying that, and it's not giving off particularly great impression that they have got on top and they fully understand what's going on and how to make their car a more consistent front runner, rather than having these weekends where they're sort of nowhere in the midfield and then occasionally being the team to beat, maybe 2, 3, 4 times a season. So I don't think they do have the answer at the moment. I think that's quite clear from sort of Toto coming out and saying, I'd rather sort of stay quiet about talking up our chances and everything before the season starts, until we sort of get to preseason testing, see the car on track, see how it performs. And even then, preseason testing is so difficult to work out who's good and who's not. You usually get a better indication of who's not looking so hot than who's looking good, and the sort of issues that might be going on behind the scenes. You start to get those sort of impressions coming across more so than who's looking particularly good, especially when we just don't know what's going on with the fuel levels and the run plans and all the programs and engine settings and all that kind of stuff. But it does seem that sort of going into the season, Mercedes are sort of downplaying at least the talk and the expectation around them. But I do, echo what Connor said in terms of, it's a new year and every new season brings new opportunity and everybody starts from scratch. Ultimately, it's a reset. So there's every chance that Mercedes can be right up there. But I'm not confident personally that they fully know what their issues are and that they've got on top of those for this season.
Yeah, it's so tough, right? In such a data-driven sport. I suppose we've got the stats here. Of course, Mercedes finished 4 last year in that 4-way team fight, which was their lowest position in a long time. And you mentioned Toto Wolff's quotes there. I've got them here, and I think it'll be helpful if we just start with that. So he said to Auto, Motor and Sport, a German publication, you start to correlate patterns. Racetracks where your car is good, practice sessions where you push your car, tyre compounds with which the car harmonizes better, and track temperatures that were good for the car. I hope we draw the right conclusions from over the winter and adjust the development direction for 2025. We won't be able to get rid of the fluctuations completely. We will also see them next year with all teams. So he sort of hedged his bets there and said, we'll fluctuate, but all the teams will fluctuate. I suppose the biggest fluctuation that isn't on the technical side is a change to the driver lineup. Lots of teams changing their driver lineup this year, as we've covered it in the last 2 shows. But I'm interested, how do you guys think Antonelli will fare? It's so much pressure. We've talked about that before, but is he the prodigy that everyone is cracking him up to be?
I mean, we're not going to know that again until we we get into the season, we hit the track and we see exactly where everyone until we see that we're just not going to know for certain. But there's a huge expectation hype surrounding Kimi Antonelli. He is seen as the real deal. Mercedes obviously believe that to be the case because they've sort of gambled on putting him in their car. But ultimately, I do, this season is going to be sort of a bedding in year for him and a season to learn and make mistakes and grow from those experiences and challenges that he'll face, with an eye to sort of next season being the first year of the new regulations, when I think Mercedes will really be looking to sort of getting back into potentially winning ways. We obviously just don't know where they're going to stand at the moment. So naturally, if they are winning races early on and potentially in championship contention, then obviously the picture sort of changes and the pressure ramps up. But I do think that he's been sort of brought in with this being the idea of being sort of a learning season for him to make those, Mercedes are expecting him to make those kind of errors and learn from those experiences. And I think that's all we can really expect. I think we'll see like really strong highs from him. And there might be a few big lows as well. Obviously he crashed on his practice debut at Monza last year within a few minutes, and I think that just sort of goes to show what we might expect when he's really pushing the limits. But in terms of sort of gearing him up for this season, ultimately Mercedes have done everything they absolutely can to sort of prepare him and get him ready. He's driven thousands of miles in old Mercedes cars over the last couple of years, taking advantage of that TPC testing, and really Mercedes have done everything within their power to sort of get him ready. And they believe in him, they know what he's capable of, and I think we have to sort of expect there to be mistakes along the way. It'll be a bit of a bumpy transition maybe, but I think that's ultimately what 2025 will be for him, will be sort of a transition year.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree with a lot of that. I think he's not... Start again? Yeah, it's hard not to disagree with all what Lewis has said. I think it's important to remember that, like, Antonelli is seen as that Mercedes, like, next Max Verstappen, they're Verstappen, so expectations will be high. If he's going into the first few races 6-7 tenths off, that's not what Mercedes will expect. I know he's a rookie, he's only 18, but he's obviously proven to Mercedes that he is good enough. He's done enough testing. I think his testing mileage is maybe comparable to even what Lewis had ahead of his rookie season. So in the sense, it depends on how competitive Mercedes are. If it is as expected, Mercedes perhaps on with the top 3 teams, then there'll be less pressure maybe to perform because they'll be 6th, 7th, 8th ahead of 2026. So I think that'd be the interesting movement to see if Antonelli can be that close to Russell or not.
Sure. He has sort of proven himself in the junior categories as well. We've seen the results he's put out there. He's won championships in the junior categories, and ultimately he bypassed Formula 3 because Mercedes thought he was that good to put him straight in F2. And we saw last season that he held his own, and he finished 6th in the championship in his rookie season. That's a very strong campaign, considering he was 17 for most of that year, got a couple of race wins. He beat his equally highly rated teammate Ollie Behrman, who's obviously got a full-time driver with Haas, and we saw what he was capable of doing when he stepped in last season in the Ferrari and the Haas and scored points in both of those cars. And both of those guys, we've got to say, they did both miss a couple of rounds of F2. I think Ollie missed a couple of races more than Kimi did, but to finish sixth in that rookie season, despite missing the final round when he was ill in Abu Dhabi, and get a couple of race wins, kind of, that he's done his talking on the track as well so far. So we just now need to see if he can sort of translate that into a form. But I think there will be that sort of patience with him on that side from Mercedes. And as Connor said, he's ultimately sort of seen as their sort of future superstar. They're not. I don't think we're not going to see him coming under huge pressure early on when they know this is like a long-term project for them. And yeah, ultimately, clearly there'll be some concern if he's 7-8 tenths off the pace, and consistently so for early parts of the season. But I think ultimately the pressure might be off him a little bit.
Yeah, and we can be certain that the atmosphere at the Italian Grand Prix that we're going to have this year will be pretty special with of course Lewis and Ferrari, and finally a home driver for them who could potentially be near the front. There was an interesting piece that Mercedes put out on their website. Of course, it's the context of a team putting out something that is effectively branding, but it was kind of really sweet to hear Kimi was talking about the moment where he got basically called up to the Mercedes team. He talked about, Toto called me into his office and said, "Are you ready to drive a Formula One car?" He said, "I could not even speak in that moment." And it's so crazy, we watch modern Formula One. It's so easy to forget how young these guys are. They're younger than all of us, right? And he's coming, as you mentioned his time in Formula 2. I think it was interesting, particularly with Formula 2, because there was a technical change coming in to this year that Prema, the team, didn't understand. Of course, Formula 2 is a spec series, but with regards to setting up the new car that they had, it was a team that really didn't understand that, layered in with Antonelli driving it for the first time. And we saw effectively throughout that year the team understand the car and the driver understand the car and be able to pull some incredible performances out. I wonder though, Russell effectively getting a natural promotion to being the team leader within that. We know kind of everyone in Formula One has different approaches to how open they are with their teammate, how forgiving they're going to be. And we've also seen a bit of an edge come out of Russell, particularly when he's raced against Max, and of course has clashed with Lewis at times too. Do you think Russell is going to be open to helping Antonelli? Is he going to play a bit of mind games and try and keep that gap there? I wonder how you think Russell's going to play it, Connor.
Lewis? Well, I think in terms of taking the team leader role, I can't think of maybe a better driver on the grid to be suited to taking up that role. He's head of the PPDA, and I think just leading the team without Hamilton, I think the way Russell presents himself as a driver as well, I think he is perfectly suited. So without Hamilton, I think Mercedes will be fine in terms of Russell leading the team. I think in terms of Antonelli, it does depend on Mercedes' competitiveness. I think Russell will be willing to help Antonelli to begin with, but it comes down to performance. And if Max Verstappen suddenly became available for 2026, or it's a bit more competitive between those two guys, Russell will have to think, I need to smash Antonelli basically on track to ensure that I'm the man for the future. So I think it is as a balancing act, but I don't see why he wouldn't. It's to the benefit of the team if they do work together well. So I do think they'll work together fine, but naturally, if they are somehow both fighting for the title, then that will certainly change.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that Russell will have an issue working and sort of supporting Kimi early on. Obviously, that might change if Kimi starts, beating him in qualifying the race. But ultimately, they've got to work together for the benefit of Mercedes. But I do actually think there's more pressure. Personally, I think there's more pressure on Russell this year at Mercedes than there is on Kimi, because I think we kind of know from everything that Mercedes have said and sort of downplaying everything around Kimi and Toto coming out and saying we're expecting him to make mistakes and give him that opportunity to learn and grow. I actually think there's more pressure on Russell, because he's just come off the season race convincingly beaten the most successful driver in F1 history, and now he's expected to sort of take up that mantle as team leader, which I think he can do. It's quite big, huge shoes to fill, really, to follow on from Hamilton, who was sort of that team leader role beforehand. And I just think to sort of follow that on and be expected to, Russell is going to be expected to beat Kimi from the off and throughout the season. And I think if we get to a stage where Kimi's outperforming Russell or ahead of him in the standings, then questions might start to get asked of Russell ultimately, because I think everyone at this stage is expecting that Kimi's maybe going to struggle or at least have a bit of a slow start to the season. So if that flips around, then I think the pressure suddenly ramps up on Russell, who also doesn't have a contract for 2026 and is sort of, in a way, fighting for his position. We're all sort of sat here assuming that he is a Mercedes driver for the long term, and ultimately they have that option on him, and that is how both parties will want to go. But he, in some ways, he's also fighting for his future, because if Kimi Antonelli is seen as this sort of superstar for the future of Mercedes, and as we know, they've been interested in Max Verstappen and remain interested, and I think if any opportunity opened up over the coming years, they would snap that up with both hands. Then it would be a question of who does he replace at Mercedes. And I think if Mercedes are putting all their eggs into Kimi Antonelli for the future, then where does that leave George Russell? So I do think there's actually quite a lot of pressure on Russell going into the season, that he's got to keep those performances going, and there's no room for complacency just because he's sort of shown he can beat Hamilton last season, and now he's sort of seen as the de facto team leader. There's still sort of no room to become complacent there.
And you spoke about, where does that leave Russell? I mean, I wonder about where that leaves Toto, right? Because Toto, sits at the top of Mercedes, having, people basically assume kind of lost the negotiation to Lewis, and led him to go to Ferrari, and then has made this kind of very bold public call up. And is one of the only owners and team principals in Formula One that has real financial skill in the game. And we were talking about last week the suggestion to us in the media that of course has been denied by the team, is that Aston Martin are willing to present Verstappen with a blank checkbook if it turns out that Antonelli can come in and challenge the structure there, and Max Verstappen can't be a part of their future plans. That might be music to Russell's ears, that he's under less pressure there, but also Toto naturally faces a lot of pressure and questions from the media. I did want to kind of go back to, again, I'm using blatantly using my notes here, but there was a nice quote from George on Antonelli on the subject we're talking about right now, again put out within Mercedes' very comfortable press guidelines. But he said, "He is such a fantastic driver. He does not have the experience yet, but I'm sure he will be up to speed very quickly. He has already integrated so well. We have both been racing from a young age, and we know what needs to be fed back to the team. He is young, but his opinion will be just as valid." And I suppose he did touch on the fact that they have kind of both grown up within, European FIA junior formula pyramid. So even though they didn't really know each other before, they have had very similar lives. Antonelli, I wonder if part of what attracted him to the team in the negotiations too was what Mercedes might have cooking for the 2026 regulations. Again, we only ever get little rumblings, but Lewis, from being around the paddock, is the kind of estimation that they are going to be right up there in 2026. Is that a clear kind of assumption?
Well, these are things that we sort of keep hearing. They get sort of drip fed out, don't we, from various camps. And we always hear the same from Ferrari as well, that sometimes they've found a whole heap of horsepower or whatever, and they're a step ahead of their rivals. And there's been sort of murmurings that Mercedes might be a step ahead currently, sort of going into 2026 with the engines. But ultimately, all this talk is kind of meaningless because nobody really knows what's going on in that sense, and certainly don't know what their rivals are doing. They only are aware of where they're at. And until we sort of hit the track in 2026, it kind of means very little. There's still a year of development for the power unit manufacturers at this stage. So even if it is true, even if Mercedes are a step ahead or Ferrari are a step ahead, whoever it is at this stage in time, that doesn't mean necessarily that in 12 months, in February 2026, when we get to testing, that they are still going to be ahead, because there's been another 12 months of development in that time. What we do know, what we can say, is that Mercedes, obviously aced the last engine regulations in 2014 with the V6 hybrid era, and obviously went on to dominate, particularly for the first few years of those regulations, and won multiple double world championships during that period. So there's a track record there that Mercedes can and do produce incredibly strong power units, and I don't see why that can't be the case again in 2026. I think Mercedes and Ferrari are bound to be sort of early sort of favourites in that sense, because you look at what they've previously achieved. Obviously, it has to be said that for 2014, Mercedes knew that was coming, and they diverted so many resources and focus into that regulation cycle because they'd been not so competitive when they returned to F1 in the early 2010s, and they weren't really making any sort of headway there in terms of becoming championship challengers. So that was their opportunity to sort of put all their eggs into that basket, and that's exactly what they did and pulled off. So yeah, I mean, at this stage, we just can't say for certain, but like I said, things could change over the next 12 months with the power unit development, but I'm sure Mercedes would absolutely be sort of up there as early favourites, just based on what they've done previously.
There is kind of a natural cycle to that, though, where you talked about them being right at the top in 2014. Not all of them, of course. James Allison came in later onto the project, but a lot of the people that were kind of important in building them up to the top in 2014 have then been recruited out to other teams. Right, you look at Andy Cowell now at the front of Aston Martin. I think it's called like brain drain, right? It's the terminology we like to use in Formula One, where you go through this cycle of a team gets to the front and then their staff become really valuable because they have the knowledge of how they got to the front. So then they get recruited by the teams lower down who are trying to get back up to the front. We spoke about Max earlier. That must be something going through his head as a Red Bull driver, losing Wheatley and Newey in the same year, both going in to senior positions at teams lower down on the grid. When we look at the two young Mercedes drivers and look back to what's happened in the past, I kind of have in my head as an interesting marker of that the Bottas-Russell collision in Imola, and a lot of the fallout from that. Dragging up controversy from the past there, but we know now that Valtteri is rejoining Mercedes as kind of a development reserve driver role. George says that the dust is settled. Do you think that there'll be an issue with them working together, Connor?
Not at all, to us. I think it's all in the past. I think Russell wanted Valtteri's seat, and obviously Valtteri wanted to keep it. So I think probably was a little bit overblown, a little bit in the media as well. So I think when it comes to drivers on the grid or like around F1, I think Valtteri Bottas is one of the nicest, best drivers to work with, very easy to work with. And I think Toto's already outlined his role sort of to mentor Antonelli as well. So I think having a driver like Bottas on the sidelines is a great personality to have in the team. And I think in terms of pace, his ability he still should be on the grid, really, if you look at it. So I think a great asset, and yeah, I think Russell's going to be the team leader. He's the main man now, so I think anything like that's all in the past.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there'll be any issues there. I mean, it's 4 years ago we're talking, and the situation was completely different. Obviously, at that time, Mercedes were in a fierce title fight with Red Bull and Hamilton and Verstappen, and Bottas was obviously seen as a key figure in that and trying to help Mercedes and Hamilton win those titles. And at the time, Russell was obviously this up-and-coming superstar, and he was trying to impress and earn that seat at Mercedes, which he ultimately did. But we're in a completely different situation now, and I don't think Bottas really sees himself getting. He obviously sees this as an opportunity to prove his worth, and which I agree with Connor. I think he deserves a seat next season anyway, and I think he's quite unlucky to have missed out on one of those seats. But this is a chance just to stay involved in the sport, and I think ultimately with an eye for a seat in 2026. And I don't think, even in Bottas's wildest dreams, I don't think he's expecting that to come at Mercedes. I think this is more to stay in the circle and to see what opportunities open up elsewhere. I think, with Cadillac coming in 2026, I think there's a clear opportunity there. There's going to be 2 new seats opening up, and he, along with the likes of Perez, are obvious candidates for a new team coming in who want an experienced driver. I mean, there's few better available than Valtteri Bottas. 10-time Grand Prix winner. He's won championships with Mercedes before in the past. He's got the experience of driving for different teams and different engine manufacturers and everything. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be sort of any needle between them. They're both professionals. We're 4 years down the line from any, as Connor said, it may have been all a bit blown up anyway at the time. And it's the heat of the moment. They just had a crash at best part of 200 miles an hour. Things are, emotions are going to be high in that moment. And with the context of everything else around that season and what that meant at that time for both those drivers, I think, time's a healer. We've moved on, and they're both adults, and I just don't see there being any kind of issue there. And I think Bottas will add to the team, and ultimately, like if Mercedes do need somebody to stand in to replace one of their drivers, then he's also he's a great option there. He'll just fit straight in. Safe pair of hands, will perform, and yeah, I just don't see there being any issue. They also win from the sort of social media side and the sort of all the character and everything that Bottas is now sort of morphed into, and the the entertainer and all that side of things that he brings from like a marketing perspectives. There's great opportunities there for him at Mercedes, and I'm sure we'll see plenty of great Valtteri Bottas content this season from that side of things. But yeah, I don't see this being a problem at Mercedes.
Yeah, for sure. I think it'll be a useful resource for Laura, our social editor. Although we did hear that there is no more calendar under the Mercedes branding, which is a shame. But for all the social admins across the sport of Formula One, I suppose we've kind of danced around it. I tried to pin you guys down for some solid predictions since Antonelli has been the subject of this podcast. Let's go. I would like a position in the drivers' championship. We know. Again, I have here on my notes. I think it's an interesting thing to mention. He's going to be running the number 12 as an allusion to Senna in his Lotus years and on his first McLaren car too. Lofty heights for his inspirations, named after Kimi Räikkönen too. Incredible world champions. Hopefully, I'm buying you guys some time to think. Where do we see Antonelli finishing this year?
I'll say 6th or 7th in the Drivers' Championship. Probably more likely 7th. I think he'll definitely be behind both Ferrari, both McLaren drivers, and Max too. So yeah, 7th, maybe 8th, around that.
With a race win as part of that.
Yeah, I think we might see him win a race. Yeah, let's say he becomes Italy's first Grand Prix winner since I think
come on
2006. I think Fisichella in Malaysia. So yeah, wait a long time for it. I think it can happen. I think on his high days, he's going to be right up there and have the pace and potential to win races. So yeah, I'll give him a race win this season.
I think right now I probably would agree. I think the key for Anthony, in my opinion, is he just needs to show that raw pace. He can improve his consistency, he can improve his time management, he can improve all these other areas. It's just about showing that lightning pace and showing that he has got the talent. But yeah, I think if Mercedes are the 4th fastest team, it's hard to look past him being maybe 7th or 8th. It's a bit boring saying that now, but maybe when we revisit it after testing, we can, we can say 3rd or 4th, or maybe you can do a bit for Lewis Hamilton and change for the title. Be cool.
Yeah, come on, I've got to edit this, Connor. I need a catchy title. But it is interesting that you mentioned what it's going to be like for him coming in, right? One of them, we talked about their kind of technical struggles earlier in the podcast, and it kind of all came back to drivability. We talk about the weight distribution, the ride height, where the driver sits within the car was kind of one of those key talking points. If it was a car that George Russell and Lewis Hamilton were struggling to drive, then I can't imagine that being easily translating down to a new rookie. Although we do know, of course, from their statements that was one of their key goals. But I like your. I think that's quite a reasonable, educated prediction. And who knows if we have a good year here at Crash F1, maybe we'll get some exclusive questions and we can ask Antonelli what he thinks. I'm sure, Lewis, you'll be in some of the Mercedes media sessions at some point this year. We can ask him how it's going. But I think I've covered everything on my notes, and we've got quite in depth there about what we can expect from Mercedes this year. Lewis, I'll say to Lewis and Connor, once again, thank you very much for joining me on the 4th episode of the podcast as we head towards the start of the year. Thank you very much for listening, watching the show. Please make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube if you're on an audio platform. Give us a 5-star review. Follow the show because it really does help from our side. Make sure to follow Laura on Instagram at Crash F1, whose graphics we've featured throughout the show and is doing some really great stuff for us over there. Check out our website where you can see all of Lewis and Connor's daily updates on the sport. That's all from me. Goodbye.